Good afternoon. My name is Terry Goldberg. I'm the Executive Director of the Northeast Waste Management Officials Association, and I want to welcome you to today's webinar where we're going to be talking about spectrum of EPR models for packaging and paper EPR programs. I'm really excited about the panel that we've got today and the presentations that you'll be hearing this afternoon. I want to sort of welcome the partners who have worked with us to plan and execute this webinar. Our colleagues from the Product Stewardship Institute, or PSI, and that includes Scott Cassell, Sydney Harris, and others from PSI, and also Lynn Rubenstein, who's the Executive Director of the Northeast Recycling Council, or NERC. Scott's the Executive Director and CEO of PSI, as many of you I'm sure know. We're going to get started in a few minutes with the presentations, but first I want to make sure everyone understands how to post their questions. If you look on your control panel for GoToWebinar, you'll see a little orange arrow at the very right top left side of the. Ooh, that was a loud. Did you hear that echo? I don't know what's going on. I apologize for that. So anyway, if you don't have the control panel open, click on the orange arrow and it should expand the control panel. If you look toward the bottom of the control panel in the gray area, you should see a row which says questions. If you want to post a question, there's a little square on the right side with a dash through it. Click on that square and it will enlarge the question box and you can type your question in that way. We ask that all questions you post in the question box. If you have something you want to communicate to the organizers, myself, Lynn, Scott, Sydney, etc., please use the chat feature, which is lower in the control panel, to just tell us about if you're having a problem with some aspects of the webinar. But we'll be monitoring the questions and we will have time, the last 20 minutes to a half an hour of the webinar will be devoted to questions. If our experience with our webinars, and I'm sure PSI is the same experience with your webinars, we have lots of questions, lots of interaction, and that's the fun part of the webinar, and we hope to get to it. We are recording this webinar. We will be posting the recordings on our websites, i.e. NMOA's, NERC's, PSI's website, to make both the recording and the slides available on our various websites, and we'll let you know how to access that information after the webinar. So I'm going to start with our introductions. We're going to first have a presentation where we're going to be talking about sort of EPR for packaging and paper products and some of the different models that have evolved both in the United States and outside of the country, and that's going to be presented by our colleagues from PSI. And then we have a panel, each of which represent a program in different states that has been proposed. And we're going to hear a little bit about the different laws that have been proposed in 3 different states. And then we're going to open it up for questions. So I'll start with introducing Scott Cassell. He has over 30 years of experience tackling waste management issues in the public, private, and nonprofit sectors. Prior to founding the Product Stewardship Institute in 2000, he served 7 years as the Director of Waste Policy and Planning for the Massachusetts Executive Office of Environmental Affairs, where he developed and implemented solid and hazardous waste management policies and programs. Scott is a nationally renowned leader in the product stewardship movement and has experience with more than 20 product categories, covering electronics, lamps, thermostats, pharmaceuticals, mattresses, packaging, and paint, just to name some of them. As PSI CEO, he's developed the widely acclaimed facilitation process that the organization uses for stakeholder engagement and consensus building, a process that resulted in the nation's first industry-run, government-mandated paint stewardship program. When he's not running all sorts of product stewardship program, he loves craft beer, Frisbee, photography, and playing the harmonica. Scott's going to be joined by Sydney Harris, who brings us a unique blend of research, facilitation, and advocacy experience to PSI's policy team She supports program and policy development, analysis, and outreach in several product categories, including packaging, pharmaceuticals, textiles, and much more. Before joining PSI, Sydney spent 4 years in Seattle working on Puget Sound policy at an environmental nonprofit and completing a research fellowship with the US EPA's Ocean Pollution and Trash-Free Waters program. Sydney is passionate about social and environmental justice and has also held many youth advocacy and education positions. Her research background began in physics, evolved into marine bioacoustics, followed by marine conservation, and eventually led her all the way to upstream to the producer responsibility programs. That's an interesting history. She holds a master's degree in marine science from the University of Auckland and a bachelor's in physics from Oberlin College. In her spare time, she enjoys getting outdoors, especially hiking, camping, scuba diving, and kayaking. So I'm going to turn it over to those guys, and then after they're done, we'll introduce the panel that will follow. So I'm going to now make you guys the presenters. Is it you?
Thanks, Terry. Yeah, I'll share the slides. So.
Okay.
All right, are you seeing them or are you seeing the wrong screen?
We are. Yes.
We are.
Great. Scott's gonna kick us off, so take it away, Scott.
All right. Thank you, Sydney. Thank you very much, Terry. I didn't realize we gave you the long version of those. So now you know everything about us. Great. Well, it's great to be here. It's great to be partnering with NERC and NUMOA, and we have 3 great speakers here, really movers and shakers nationally, as well as in their own local governments and states. Next slide, please. All right, so just a little bit about the Product Stewardship Institute. We're a national nonprofit organization. We've been building the capacity for product stewardship in the US with a lot of these folks and many others for the past 20 years. We do have members from 47 of the state environmental agencies, hundreds of local governments as well. That's our board of directors. We also have partners, over 100 partners from companies, organizations, universities, and international government. So we try to bring the best policies internationally down to the local and state level here and work nationally across the country. We have worked on 122 EPR laws have passed in the United States thanks to the huge network and many folks that are here on this call today. And you can see all the lists of products, and you're all familiar, but we're here to talk about packaging today, which is the big enchilada that we've been working on for 15 years at the PSI of the 20 years we've been here. And the past 2 years has been the time where things have started to explode. Next slide, please. So for that packaging, we have been working with almost a dozen different states. We call them active states here in 2021, and 3 of them are here representing those 3 states. You'll be hearing much more about them. You can see in the map where the activity is. It's very much mirrors the activity on EPR in the United States, the West Coast, and then the Northeast for most of that activity, with Maryland trying to draw it down further south in the eastern part of the country. So our organization developed a model, which we'll talk about a little bit more, but developed a model for packaging and paper products. And we use that same model for all of the different products that we work on together. And that model has actually been, I'd say, the fodder for working with Jen in Vermont, with Danny in Maryland, and Dawn in New York. And like our organization, we don't dictate anything for these different states. We bring the best model, the best practices on each of the elements of a bill to these different states, and then we facilitate with that group. And for Jen in Vermont, it was the Vermont Product Stewardship Council, and out of that came their bill with a lot of leadership from Jen and others there. And we did the same with Dawn and the New York Product Stewardship Council, and out of that came another bill, which is sort of that hybrid model. And then with Danny and Maryland, they used our bill and working with it and their own expertise about what Maryland wants to craft that bill. So you know, we played some role, but a lot of the credit here goes to the three folks here. The same is with the Federal Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act. That model has been used as the EPR component of that bill. Next slide, please. Thanks. So this is just a slide to show the spread of EPR globally. This is from Lorax and EPI. It is, you can see that Canada has had these laws in place, EPR for packaging and paper products, for over 15 years. It's been over 35 years in Europe, and many other countries are introducing these bills. So it is, you know, it's about time for the US. And there's a lot of expertise. That's the thing, is that we're not starting from nowhere. We're starting with a lot of experience around the world. Next slide. So these are the 15 elements. I'm not going to go through them here, but we have figured out a method for developing policy, and we do this for all of we did it for the solar panels working with Dawn. We've done it for gas cylinders recently. We're doing it for electronics right now. And we did this for packaging and paper products. And we're going to be talking about that green square, which is the funding allocation. So that's where Sydney's expertise here. She's going to pick up and take us the next couple of slides. Sydney?
Awesome. So yeah, welcome to EPR Schoolhouse Rock, everybody, with a little bit less singing and hopefully as easy to understand. But as Scott mentioned today, we're really only talking about one of these 15 elements, and I really want to emphasize that because we know all 15 of these are super duper important, but within the confines of this discussion, it's helpful to zero in on just one because each one of these could be days of discussion. So we're here to talk about funding allocation and, oops, program models, and my slides are running away. Okay. Hopefully what you can see on your screen now is a very colorful conceptual model that PSI created last year just to kind of help put some visual aids to what an EPR for packaging system can look like. This obviously does not apply in practice to every single system around the world that Scott just showed you, but it is some of the fundamentals. I'm not going to go through in great detail what's on here, but you can see that you start at the top left where it says start. You're a consumer in this diagram and you purchase a vase from a made-up company called Vases Inc. The vase comes in 3 different packaging material types. One is recyclable, that's the cardboard box. We all know we love to recycle cardboard, and so you can see it like gets picked up by the truck and goes to the MRF and gets pulped and turned into another box. And the other 2 materials have their streams. They are not recyclable, so they go to a landfill or to a research program. But where we're really focusing today is on the right side of this diagram. Sorry if you can hear him meowing. I've been joined by a cat who has snuck into the room. On the right side of this diagram, we have green circle and a blue circle, and these are showing the 2 existing basic models for funding allocation in these EPR systems that we see in place today. So one is municipal reimbursement, this green circle here, where the Vases Inc., this made-up company, has paid fees on all the packaging that it used to a PRO, a producer responsibility organization. That money is either going to flow to a local government who is going to continue operating recycling programs or contracting with collectors and recyclers for those services and get reimbursed by that PRO. Or in option 2, we see full producer responsibility where the PRO is directly going to contract with those service providers. And that's really the fundamental 2 ends of what we like to think of as a spectrum for how these programs can work. So we'll get into that a little bit more. Again, under these 2 ends of the spectrum, there's a few key points that we really want to note. Under full EPR or full responsibility, these programs are entirely financed by producers. So all the way from collection through to processing, typically. And the PRO also typically manages the day-to-day operations of the program. So again, that would be the PRO directly contracting with a collector or a MRF. This option still allows flexibility for local governments to choose their level of involvement in the program, and that's really important. But they do not have as much control in the system as they would under a municipal reimbursement model, because typically in these full EPR systems, local governments can act as contractors to the PRO, so they can act as service providers, but they may be at a slight disadvantage in those negotiations depending on how that pans out. On the other end of the spectrum, we have municipal reimbursement. This is where municipalities would continue their day-to-day management of any programs they have, and if they hold contracts with collectors and processors, they would just kind of keep doing that. But it's important to note that in these systems, even with the law requiring, that municipalities get 100% of their costs financed by the PRO, typically we do not see fully 100% of costs actually being covered. So I'll break that down a little bit more for you. So under full EPR, typically we see, again, these are systems like the famed British Columbia system that everybody talks about. That's the only real full EPR system in North America. You see typically 3 options for local governments here. They can partially opt into the system, which was the most popular option when the BC system rolled out. So local governments can, again, decide to operate as a contractor or service provider to the PRO, or they can fully opt in and they can say, I don't want to do recycling anymore. You do it, and the producer, the PRO, takes over the day-to-day management and obviously pays for the day-to-day operations there. And then they always have an option to just opt out. So they could say, we're just going to keep doing our own thing. We don't need any funding from you. Thanks, but no thanks. That's obviously the least popular option. Then under municipal reimbursement, I wanted to show you 2 examples very briefly. These are from Quebec and Ontario. Both, it's important to note, are now kind of old models, but they are the sort of most commonly cited in the US examples of municipal reimbursement systems. And each province did this really differently. So it's interesting to look at them side by side. Quebec's municipal reimbursement program requires the PRO to pay 100% of municipal costs for running their programs. We've done research on that, and there are incentives, of course, for keeping costs down, cost efficiency in the system. And so what Quebec does is they average municipal costs among groups of munis that are grouped by size and location, like how rural or urban they are. And on average, they get reimbursed about 96% of their expenses, which is pretty good. It's pretty close to 100, but it is not 100. Unfortunately, we've seen in that system continued, system fragmentation like we experience in the US. Everything is still controlled at a municipal level. That means there's not really harmonization across the province in terms of what's collected. So you still see contamination and resident confusion. And in Ontario, similar system, municipal reimbursement, but the costs there are capped at 50%. So nobody has been getting more than 50% of their expenses there because the law says the producers are only responsible for paying 50% of municipal costs. And so we've also seen stagnated recycling rates in Ontario, and both of these systems after decades are transitioning to full EPR models. So again, these are sort of old models at this point, but they're both in the process of transitioning. So those are 2 ends of the spectrum, full EPR, municipal reimbursement. We're here to talk about more than just those 2 things. And in particular, we want to highlight a third sort of middle approach. We call it the hybrid approach that was really kind of invented here in the US. So we'll hear more about that. I'm not going to steal John's thunder, but I do want to point out the 3 amazing panelists we have here are each going to talk about their bills, and I've sort of placed them on this slide here where they fall on this spectrum roughly. So a little bit about the hybrid approach. It's sort of a combination of municipal reimbursement and full EPR. There again are options for local governments, but they are slightly different this time. So again, municipalities can decide they want to keep running their day-to-day programs, but this time instead of being a contractor to the PRO, they would opt to receive reimbursements. So there's that municipal reimbursement model coming in. But under this model, they also have the option to fully turn their program over to the PRO. So they have a little bit more flexibility here to say, we actually don't want reimbursements. We kind of want to do more like a BC thing. We don't want to do this anymore. You do it, and the PRO has to figure that out and run that system. And again, there's always an option to completely opt out and just say, thanks, but no thanks. I don't really I'm just going to do my own thing and I won't take any funding, which of course is unlikely to be a very popular option. The important thing to note about this hybrid model and why it kind of got invented here, I think, of course, it's always tempting to try to get the best of both worlds, but we also have sort of a unique situation on the ground in the US that isn't really present in Canada and across Europe, and that is subscription communities. So these are places many of you may live in where there is no municipal recycling program, right? So maybe you're paying a private company that you found online to come, get your stuff from curbside, or maybe that's not even an option for you. But in those cases where there is no municipal program, what we want to avoid as we transition to EPR in the US for packaging is we really don't want a system where we say, okay, great, this is great. The producer's going to run recycling statewide, or everybody's going to get reimbursed. And so maybe, all these towns in a given state are now getting like this great new recycling service, but then where there was subscription communities, there's no program to be reimbursed. There is no one to turn it over to producers. So we're just stuck in this system where towns get stranded and then they still have to pay out of pocket. Why should I have to pay a private company to take my recyclables away if my neighbor a town over is getting this great new service? So we want to avoid that inequity in the system. And the way this hybrid model approaches that is they say in those places, the PRO must still ensure recycling access and program performance. So it is not an average across the state. It is in every community there must be access. And so in those communities, the PRO would likely step in and start contracting with service providers and making sure that recycling is happening there. And that's a really key point. So those are the complex slides. Almost done. A few key considerations that we just wanted to touch on, and again, there's not going to be time to go into these in depth, but I just want to mention them because they're very important. Concepts that have emerged in our EPR discussions and in the discussions around many of the bills that you're going to hear about today are things like building in a transition period. So moving from where we're at right now to an EPR system is a big change, no matter what state you're in. There's certainly been interest in a sort of legislated transition period where maybe it's a few years or something while everybody gets up to speed. Things may change more slowly until the program can fully ramp up, sort of an on-ramp. Requirements to use existing infrastructure like contracting with existing collectors and MRFs are really important. We don't want people to have to be losing out on their investments that they've made in that infrastructure. Protection of proprietary information for MRF operators and collectors is very important. Also, in these different models, you can start to see how there's different chains of custody for who owns the materials that are collected at each stage. And so that obviously varies between a full EPR model versus a municipal reimbursement model, and it's important to consider that in each model. Funding for infrastructure and innovation and market development are important in every EPR bill, and they're, of course, considerations that are important here. And then lastly, I anticipated that, this may come up. It's a very big hot topic right now, the role of advisory councils in these bills and in all sorts of EPR bills, just sort of looking at the system and how it's governed, what opportunities there are for the community and organizations to get involved and have their say and oversight over the program. So advisory councils are becoming a key topic, and they can be appointed either by the legislature or the state agency or the governor or even by the PRO. Different ways to do an advisory council, and the idea is to have multi-stakeholder representation. They could review or even help draft stewardship plans. They could advise on or negotiate key program elements, and they could advise both the state and the PRO. So lots of options there for advisory councils, but just wanted to mention that. And that is where I'm going to stop. So just want to also mention, we have a lot of great resources. We can drop these links in the chat if folks want to explore these things more. The report that we published last year does go into more depth if you're more of a reading person than a webinar person, then check that out. It's got more of an overview of each of these systems. And then here is our contact info.
Thank you so much, Sydney. That was great. And Scott? So now we're going to switch to our panel, and we're going to first hear from Dawn Tim, who is the director of the Division of Environmental/Solid Waste in Niagara County in New York. For the last 13 years, she has been dedicated to efforts related to waste reduction, recycling, and collection efficiency in and around Niagara County. Dawn is also very active in the statewide solid waste organizations, most notably the New York State Product Stewardship Council, where she participates in the advancement of product stewardship policy with the goal of decreasing expenses to local rural governments. So we'll start with Dawn, and Dawn then we'll switch to Danielle DiPietro, if I got that right, who is the legislative director for Delegate Brooke Learman in the state of Maryland. Prior to joining Brooke's staff, she worked for a variety of nonprofit organizations in Baltimore, New Orleans, and in Chennai, India, each focused on providing public health and health equity. She studied public health at Tulane University, and she's a native of Maryland. And finally, on our panel this afternoon, we're going to hear from Jen Holliday. She's the Director of Public Policy and Communications and the Legislative Liaison for the Chittenden Solid Waste District, CSWD. CSWD is Vermont's most populous solid waste district, responsible for overseeing and providing solid waste services to its 18 member cities and towns. She's been with the CSWD since 1991 and has an in-depth understanding of solid waste management and its challenges from the local government perspective. Jen has extensive experience with EPR as a founding member and chair of the Vermont Product Stewardship Council, which was formed in 2008. Since then, she has helped to craft and pass 5 EPR laws in Vermont and continues to advocate for EPR legislation on household hazardous waste, packaging, and other consumer products. Jen has served on the Product Stewardship Institute board since 2010 and was the chair from 2013 to 2018. So we're first going to hear from Danny, and then we'll take it from there. I will make Danny the presenter now.
Is that working?
Looks good. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm Danny DiPietro, as mentioned, Legislative Director for Delegate Brooke Learman in Maryland. So just for a little bit of context, the reason we decided to pursue this, apart from being really impressed by all the research and support of PSI, was based on data that came back from a survey. Delegate Learman chairs the work group on waste reduction and recycling in Maryland as part of her role on the Environment and Transportation Committee. So last summer, we disseminated surveys to every county in Maryland, asking, for information about their existing recycling, composting, waste programs, and to share a little bit about how that was going financially. And the responses clearly demonstrated a need for comprehensive approaches to upgrade counties' recycling abilities, encourage upstream waste reduction, and to support governments financially. They were really asking for help. So with that in mind, Brooke Learman introduced HB 36 with the goal of supporting local governments monetarily and addressing the waste crisis in Maryland. So I'll run through these slides pretty quickly. As in many other states, EPR already applies to several products in Maryland, such as batteries, products that contain mercury, some electronics. This past legislative session, this January to April of this year, there were 2 EPR bills introduced, ours for packaging and paper products, and then also a paint EPR bill. And the biggest difference between the two and what we'll focus on today is that under HB 36, we retain municipal waste and recycling systems for collection, transportation, and sorting, and simply ask the producers to contribute financially. Whereas with other EPR programs, as Sydney touched on, they're either set up as like take-back programs or full-blown producers running, new systems. So the goals of this bill were to reduce waste and help local governments out with costs. The process, which will probably look similar in the other examples you hear, was to get producers to come together and create a product stewardship organization, and then together build a product stewardship plan, which will be submitted to the Maryland Department of the Environment. And we left our bill pretty kind of broad and leave a lot of the details up to regulation and rules to be worked out between the product stewardship organization and the Department of the Environment. So the meat of the bill is really, and the bill is actually only like 9 pages, maybe even 6 with amendments. It really just outlines what the stewardship plan needs to include, and that's membership, performance goals, which are broken down in our bill with amendments by material type. The types of goals we require are things like post-consumer recycled content of packaging, recyclability and compostability standards, and general waste reduction and packaging reduction goals. They also must detail in this plan how they will meet these goals, how they will engage a wide variety of stakeholders, including recyclers, haulers, local governments. And then, most important, how the financing will work. So again, it's left pretty open. They must work with local governments. The producers must work with local governments to come up with a fee structure and a reimbursement structure. So we do not name the percent specifically that is going to be required for reimbursement levels. We just say that based on existing costs that local governments incur for transport, processing, and recycling, the product stewardship organization must work with the government to come up with a reimbursement system. And then the producers must also come up with the set of incentives and disincentives to try to really get at better packaging and less packaging at a higher level. So last slide, we do have a page kind of detailing accountability because a lot of this is left fairly open and up to rules and regulations. So the accountability kind of standards in the bill are that the producers must, everything has to be submitted to and approved by MDE. We assume there'll be a lot of back and forth. A public website must be created so that the process is transparent and residents can understand what's going on and get involved. And then there's a very clear prohibition in the bill that, if the plan is not created and approved and adhered to, there's just a flat prohibition on producers from acting in the state. And then there are civil penalties written in there and some other kind of legal language making these binding and subject to independent audits. So this past session was the first time this bill was introduced. I think we made good headway and just need to do more education and listening in the interim, and we'll bring it back next year.
All right, can everybody see me there? Good. All right, I'm Dawn Tim. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking to you all about the proposal that we have here in the state of New York. But I just lost my screen here, all right? So I'm not going to beat the dead horse here, but to Danny's point, we here in New York, felt the combined impacts of China National Sword and, simultaneously the poor commodity values. You start, adding more issues and we're sinking. Stagnant recycling rates. We've had policy constraints, and we've really just kind of eroded the system so much we've exposed the flaws in our program. And many municipalities are struggling, and that has been underscored, bold, and highlighted with the pandemic. And what it comes down to here in the state of New York is that engaging manufacturers and employing an EPR strategy has been successful for other components, and we certainly sought to make that same improvement by embarking in packaging policy. For us here in New York, we were spending close to $60 million, which was an increase from 2019 of up 50%. So it was substantial. So as we were in dire straits, budgets and the policymakers and constituents that became upset over rising taxes and rising fees, started to fan the flames, if you will, of these flaws. When we were a community out here in Western New York that I represent, we were seeing benefits of $5 and $10 a ton for recycling, and in just 7 short years, we were paying $70+ a ton. So that is the background truly in how we arrived at the motivation for our policy. And the New York State Product Stewardship Council works very closely with PSI, and we started with PSI's elements. Scott and Sydney had presented their slide showing those components. We incorporated a broad group of folks from across the state. I can assure you, both firsthand experience and professionally can tell you that there is a substantial difference between New York City Department of Sanitation's program and those that are operated in Western New York. The North Country, Adirondack region, the center of the state, all vary substantially. And this group of folks in the state of New York are our stakeholder group that was mediated by PSI, walked through each of the elements, and we were able to arrive at what we felt best covered all corners of New York State. So I'll briefly comment on some of the critical components that we found and then tell you where our bill ended up. Excuse me. We had Senator Todd Kaminsky, the chair of New York State's Environmental Conservation Committee. He had introduced S 1185, and by the end of session, it to the C-print. So our bill included all primary, secondary, and tertiary packaging that was intended for the residential market, and that included online sales. For just a layman perspective, I'm a Huggies purchaser from Amazon. So the box that it comes in, Amazon, with that packaging, with the Huggies box, and then with the plastic insert, all of that packaging is what is covered under Kaminsky's 1185 bill. We sought to have municipalities maintain control of their systems. So we're the hybrid model, and I think at one point I heard Sydney refer to it as the Goldilocks model. Not too hot, not too cold. This we felt benefited the state of New York for those communities that don't have access to recycling and are doing a self-haul or a subscription service, all the way up to communities that have publicly operated or privately operated curbside service, irregardless of who owned and operated the MRF, who owned and operated the collection fleet, or if it were a private subscription service. We sought to include programs that covered homes, parks, schools, and existing customers. This was a bit of a sticking point, which we can get to in questions, but those existing customers in a rural community may just be single, double, and triple family homes, whereas a single, double, and triple family home is something that doesn't necessarily exist in Manhattan. They're large, municipally provided for services that needed to be incorporated. We sought, just in any EPR program, for a PRO to manage itself, to manage their manufacturers, if you will, for the products. And we designed in this the incentive, if you will, in this bill for the PROs to set eco-modulating fees that would incentivize the reduction in toxicity of products, and also design for the environment. we had enhanced the education component, and this also came into play into why we felt that some of New York's municipalities would benefit from a full producer responsibility model or a hybrid model. There are some communities that have staff and resources that have been dedicated for years to manage and operate their MRF, but also educate and outreach into the community. We wanted the producers also in this bill to have some accountability for labeling and instructions. It's important to have multilingual pictures and consistency. I'm sure many of us can nod our heads yes, that recycling can be confusing if you're going by the numerical values on plastic. And, can this grade of paper, if it's wax coated or aseptic containers, can it be recycled? We were looking to streamline that and truly use that as one of the springboards to propel us out of that plateau of our recycling rates. The program funding would be managed by this PRO, and Cindy brought up the advisory group. We had spent a lot of time behind the scenes thinking about how we can get all stakeholders involved and keep them involved, trying to find that common language between local governments, global manufacturers, and recyclers and haulers and constituents, and even development for alternate recycling ideas. I mean, these were groups that we sought to engage and had provided in the law that there were at least some governance structure with how a PRO would have an advisory group and just what those advisory group responsibilities were. Our clock started at 3 years, so 4 years. The first year would require a needs assessment analysis to provide the foundations to really where were the data gaps in the state, what type of capital expenses and investment would be needed in certain sectors, and of course answering a lot of the how is this going to happen, how is this going to work, how will reimbursement occur in the state. And because we're a hybrid model, there's the expectation that organization would need to come from, are you in or are you out? Are you going to transition from your current municipally operated program and turn it over to the PRO, or are you going to seek reimbursement? And my last point here is that we sought to create incentives for the brand owners in engaging throughout our entire process here in New York. We engaged the environmental groups and organizations, and as well as local governments and haulers, and when possible, we had brand owners represented. And we, had a lot of shape to our bill. We were on the C print. We have some wounds and we have some good stories to talk about, where we ended up. I think it's safe to say that we may have suffered a couple wounds that were difficult to recover from, and I can say from New York's perspective, we had newspapers included, newspapers and magazines, and newspapers and magazines have the function of full print, and print they did. They were not in favor, and they were very vocal, and this was a key learning point and a lesson for us as we will start the 21-22 legislative session with this bill. We didn't make it out of the Senate, but we had very, very firm support from Senator Kaminsky, and the Assembly was engaged throughout the process. And we hope in the next session that we can pick back up where we left off.
While we're waiting for Jen to go, this is Scott. I just wanted to invite people to send in your questions. So as you have them, so please send in your questions. Thank you.
Okay, is that working? Great. Okay. Well, hello, everyone. It's great to be here. I'm going to talk about our approach in Vermont. So legislators indicated to us, to the Vermont Product Stewardship Council members and others during the session before, that they were interested in EPR for packaging. So the Vermont Product Stewardship Council, whose members are all the solid waste districts and alliances in the state, formed a working group with Sydney and Scott from PSI, and we walked through each element of EPR legislation for packaging and printed material. And the core group included representatives from solid waste districts and alliances, the Agency of Natural Resources, a hauler who also owns and operates a MRF, and we also had discussions with the Flexible Packaging Association and MRFS that helped to inform our discussion. And we used the 8 elements that the Flexible Packaging Association and state and local government had agreed on in the PSI dialogue process as our guideposts to creating the elements document. The working group met from June through December and finalized the elements document in December. And this was the basis that informed Leg Council in drafting our EPR bill for PPP H142, which was introduced in January of this year. So it's important to keep in mind, I'll be presenting on this bill that has not been vetted by the legislature at all. It was not taken up this year. Just keep that in mind. So the bill did not include everything that the working group recommended either. And so there's some areas where I think it definitely could be improved. But the basics of the bill is starting with what packaging and paper products are covered, which is all consumer packaging and printed material, including secondary and tertiary packaging, regardless of the generator. So it covers packaging and printed paper that is residential, as well as businesses and institutions that generate it, as long as it's consumer packaging. And so in order to sell it in the state, the producer must participate in a PRO with an approved program plan. And the bill does not allow for individual producer responsibility. So it has to be through a PRO. There can be more than one PRO, but there can only be one program plan. So multiple PROs must work together to submit that one plan. The bill does not, the law would not apply to producers with less than 1 ton of material or less than $1 million in gross annual revenue. And it also doesn't apply to bottle bill material. So the plan, sorry, okay. So the plan has to include how to provide free collection of covered materials that are recyclable at the curb, drop-off locations, transfer station, and public places. It has to provide payment to collectors and material recovery facilities at a rate that covers all the costs, which includes administration, facility and equipment costs, maintenance, fuel, and labor. That's all spelled out in the bill. All collection locations and haulers must be allowed to opt into participating in the program, and all material recovery facilities, we have 2 single stream facilities in the state, which are process the majority of the recyclables. They must be utilized at the same rate that they're utilized prior to the program. And this was the working group's solution to protecting investments made and ensuring the smaller haulers wouldn't be pushed out. The program plan has to include a funding mechanism to implement the program. It is an eco-modulated fee-based funding mechanism that incentivizes producers to use reusable and recyclable products, and also to contain post-consumer recycled content. The mechanism must also penalize materials that are disruptors in the recycling stream or are a common source of litter or can't be recycled. Under the performance standards, the program has to be designed to manage covered materials according to a hierarchy of source reduction first, reuse, recycling, waste to energy, landfilling, and incineration. And over time, the rates at the top of the hierarchy have to increase. The program must achieve higher rates of reuse, recovery, and recyclability and recycled content for covered materials based on weight and type of material over time. It's all proposed in the plan by the producers. It's not spelled out in the legislation what those rates are. Vermont has an incredibly high level of convenience due to an existing law that requires recyclables to be collected wherever trash is collected. So public places, curbside pickup, transfer stations, and drop-off sites all have to be supported by the program. Public education is an important component of the plan, and it includes notification to the public on how to access the collection programs, what's included, and they have to work with existing solid waste planning entities and collectors. So it's not necessarily pushing out education efforts that are already happening on the ground with local government, but working with local government is part of the requirement. Labels also must be used to educate consumers about end-of-life management of covered materials and show how they'll improve over time to a consistent labeling standard. And then evaluation on the effectiveness of the education and outreach efforts is also a requirement. And if performance goals aren't met, the producers can be required to improve the education program. The program plan also has to have a component of how it will minimize litter and include funding for litter cleanup of covered materials. And finally, there's an annual report requiring, among other things, the type and weight of covered materials collected, as well as an estimate of the amount of covered materials by type and weight sold in the state so that the recovery rates can be calculated and compared to the performance goals. So that's the framework of the program. The bill also requires the secretary to appoint an advisory council, and it consists of 13 members, including stakeholders involved in the use, collection, and recovery of covered materials, as well as environmental organization and an organization representing equity and underrepresented stakeholders. Sorry about that. Did we miss that slide? Sorry about that. So the idea on the role of the advisory committee is to provide non-binding input on all aspects of the stewardship plan, and for the secretary to take that into consideration when approving the plan or amendments to the plan. The council could also make recommendations on regulatory changes to improve the program, and would review and advise the PRO on the annual reports. So last but not least, the advisory council would advise the PRO on payment rates and terms to compensate haulers, transfer stations, and drop-off sites that provide their services for the program. The working group had requested that this advisory committee would have had the authority to set those rates and terms. However, the Ledge Council did not feel that was legal, so it is advisory only. So there's obviously a lot more provisions in the bill that are typical of many EPR bills in a trust, role of the agency, registration fee consideration. Another element that I didn't cover was private right of action, which is a significant one that is a component of the bill that we don't have time to go into, but it is worth considering. And this is the first year of the biennium, so the bill will, although it wasn't taken up this year, it is still alive and can be taken up next year, and that is our hope. So thank you.
Great. Well, Sydney, I guess I'll jump in here. All right.
Yeah, take it away. Thank you to
All
all the
right.
panelists.
Yeah, well, thank you. Danny and Dawn and Jen, thanks for those presentations. Great layout and overview of some of the details in each of these bills. So this is to the audience. So I'm going to ask each of the panelists here a question. We're going to go through a little bit of a quick Q&A amongst ourselves. And then there's time for your questions. And I want to ask you to send them in. I can't see them while I'm doing this, so I know Terry is going to be monitoring those, I believe. And Terry, I don't mind if you want to jump in at some point and ask a question at the same time, you know, and then we can mix it up between questions from the audience and ones that I ask here. And Sydney, I want to invite you in as well. You've got a lot of knowledge, of course, on this topic, and let's have this as more conversational. Sound good?
So just to amend that, Scott, we do have a lot of questions coming in, and Lynn is going to facilitate that part of the Q&A.
Okay, excellent.
But we welcome more questions.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. I feel like this is a power women panel. I'm so pleased with Terry and Lynn also, and you four here. Wow, this is awesome to be invited into this. So the first question, and Danny, let me start with you. Is how did you choose this model, or how did the model that came to be known as the Maryland's model or Maryland's bill? How did it come about? Do you think it's more of the reimbursement model, more of the existing landscape? Why was that best for Maryland?
Thanks, Scott. Delegate Learman and I basically, with support from Scott and Sydney, took a look at the bills that had been introduced in 2019. Basically kind of read through and analyzed them, and in part just with Delegate Learman's institutional knowledge, and in other part through tons of meetings, mostly with local government officials, decided that the reimbursement model would have the best chance of passage. From our perspective, it's less disruptive to current local government activities. There might be a little bit less of like a shock factor in introducing this when we can kind of frame it as we're just offering, we're just trying to set up a system that provides, monetary support rather than, rather than we are going to allow producers to kind of come and make their new contracts. And even if maybe that leaves less responsibility for local governments, I think it's still a little more scary of an idea, or overwhelming, I guess I should say. The other thing is, in this survey that I mentioned in my presentation, in addition to asking for, financial information and a description of existing waste and recycling system, we also just had an open-ended last question that just said, like, how can the state help? What can we do to support you? And sometimes directly it was stated, we need EPR. Other times that those words weren't used, but what they were describing was EPR with municipal reimbursement. So we just kind of went forward based on what we heard that folks wanted. And then the last thing I'll say is we definitely took a lot of what we liked from other states, but certainly there were local, like some local considerations to be made. A lot of folks who deal with boats and wrapping boats, winterizing boats, came to us with concerns about would their, plastic wrap be considered packaging? So of course there were a lot of local considerations, but that's the origin of how we got here, origin story.
Real quick question as a follow-up for you, and then I'm gonna go to Jen next. Was there any distrust of the producers coming in, or a concern over giving up control? Is that part of what the interest was in Maryland?
I would say yes. Either that we heard it directly or kind of knew that we would. When I mentioned like it might be a little bit more overwhelming, I think trust would have been a big factor there. Yes.
Okay, thank you for that. It might be because there's fewer EPR laws passed there and less comfort with EPR in the state. So I'm going to move to Jen in Vermont here, which you've taken more of the full responsibility approach, which actually gave the producers more leeway. You have more laws passed almost than any other state. And so why was that bill the way it came out? Why do you think that was best for Vermont?
Well, just to touch on what you just said, Scott, is the other EPR laws that we have in place are full EPR laws as well. So that's kind of how what we know is full responsibility. But the crux of it really is that we don't really have municipalities at the local level providing these services. There's just a two or three very small handful of municipalities that do. And so it seemed that if we can assure that the haulers can stay whole, it is preferable to go to full responsibility, where the producers have to really get more involved in the problems and solving those problems as well. So that's the primary reason why it just made sense that it wasn't reimbursement, because there's really nobody to reimburse except, contracted by haulers.
Right. Okay. You're more of a subscription, almost full subscription, as Sydney explained before. Thank you. So Dawn, moving to you and the Goldilocks model, and I have to say that Sydney has coined that term. I guess maybe she has to work on the copyright with Goldilocks, but the hybrid model here. Why was that the best approach for New York?
Sure. Thanks, Scott. We have a real diverse, quite a few diverse programs across the state. We obviously have New York City, which is a publicly operated collection operation to a private MRF. We have very rural communities that are subscription based. We have some rural communities that finance their own solid waste facility, as well as a transfer station or even a process or a MRF for that's under public control. So with a real diverse the service provided, the services provided here, we felt that there were municipalities that would very much appreciate going to a full reimbursement. You take over PRO, and there were other communities that would be bound to whether it be labor agreements or expenses related to their infrastructure that would require them to continue the operations as is, and therefore seeking reimbursement would have best suited them.
Okay, great, thank you. So Dawn, starting with you with the next question, coming around the horn and go back the other way. In terms of the pros and cons of the system, what would you say were the highlights? The couple of things that were really strong in this bill that you felt helped to get passage, at least in the Senate, and get big support across the state, and then a couple of things that maybe were a little bit weaker in the bill.
Sure. I think that we included a very broad range of products, and those that really were truly targeted in our municipal recycling stream. We spent a lot of time with that, as you're aware of. That was definitely a strong point, including online sales, enhancing education, taking the complexity out of recycling. We also, sought for some capital expense and some funds that could reimburse municipal governments for, the real costly components. Those were truly, I feel, our strong points. It was definitely focused on who is contributing into the program, what materials are there. And truthfully, we did spend quite a bit of time on also the having the PROs and the advisory. That was important.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Jen, how about pros and cons for the Vermont system?
I think definitely what the scope of material, because it's not just residential, it's all material that's consumer-based products. So I think that's a really strong position and will move us forward. Also, I lost my train of thought, sorry.
Pros and cons.
Yeah, the pros and cons. So yeah, the scope of products and also the requirement to use existing infrastructure, because we have an incredible infrastructure in Vermont. We have a backdrop of a law that requires is mandatory recycling, requires haulers to provide collection services for recycling and solid waste, to require public places to collect recyclables where trash is collected, require transfer stations and drop-off centers to also collect recyclables. So with that infrastructure in place, if it's supported, I think, we're at a 73% recovery rate for recycling. So I think that's really awesome. I think where it's a little bit weak is that there's no penalties built in for the performance goals. Right now, I think that we could do better with the eco-modulation. I think more thought needs to be considered about greenhouse gas emissions, but that might be 2.0. It's a lot to cover with, in the beginning, because there's so much change. So I think.
Thank you, Jen. And Danny, what are the highlights of the bill, would you say, and then maybe some of the weak points you might want to work on next year?
Sure. I think a pro, and it was really interesting to hear Jen and more context around existing infrastructure. And so I think a pro of our model for Maryland is that our counties are really already running their own, most of them curbside collection, and have pretty robust systems. Like when we sent out this survey, I was able to find a Department of Public Works or a specific waste and recycling contact in almost every county. So I think that makes it so that this reimbursement model does fit well. I think, like I mentioned, I think a pro is that it's perceived to be less disruptive to the counties, who we really need to be on board and get their support. And then I think on the other side of the coin, I think the producers also liked it, it's all relative, but liked it because they saw our bill, or what we were asking them to do, as less kind of out of scope, maybe, as compared to taking over the whole system. I think a big pro of the bill and the process was producers really came to the table, and I don't know how, the experience that Dawn and Jen had, but we were pleased with the level of cooperation. We thought, the amendments they suggested were largely very reasonable, and I think we got to a really good place, a middle ground. So I think those are some pros. Cons, I guess, of this model and our bill. If we're doing reimbursement of existing systems, I guess we just need to acknowledge that the existing systems aren't always running at optimal levels. So producers aren't really thrilled about, paying or reimbursing a, recycling processing center that just isn't using the best technology or might be inefficient. So I think that's an issue. We did try to address that through an amendment to the bill, which created a separate pool of money that could be distributed in the form of grants to improve recycling, collection, and processing. So that's one thing. And then the last thing I'll say, I guess, is more work to do in the interim. Is I don't think we ever really got, we had really good conversations with producers, and we had really good conversations with environmental groups, but I think they never got to a place where they were both in agreement over the goals or, the final product of the bill. So I think just more cooperation and collaboration between the folks on the two ends of the spectrum, where we're kind of in the middle, would help move things more smoothly next year.
Okay, thanks. So you're jumping into the last question I have, and maybe we can do this one quickly. So I know Lynn has some good questions from the audience here. So Danny, let me just follow up on that. You mentioned, you had support from the Flexible Packaging Association and Citizens for the Campaign for Recycling and Environment, and MRFS, the first time ever, did not oppose a bill on EPR. So that was actually monumental here in the United States. But you still weren't able to pass the bill. So you mentioned working with the producers and the environmental groups, kind of bringing them together on the same page. Is that the major obstacle that you would see that you'd want to overcome next year, or are there others that you think you need to work on?
I don't think there were really super specific obstacles. In my opinion, it was just the general context and environment we're working in. So much of the focus of this past legislative session was like immediate, visible priorities, related to COVID and fixing the unemployment system and helping folks with, staying housed. So I think, frankly, this just wasn't the top priority, and it didn't get voted down. The hearing was actually very good, and I think it just like wasn't, remaining at the top of the agenda because of competing priorities. I do think it'll help next year to have a more unified body of support, and I think just having more time to educate advocates, legislators, and the general public about kind of what this is and what it will look like, and getting more vocal support from counties. I mean, certainly no county opposed it and several did send in testimony, but just more time, I think, is what we need to get everybody on the same page.
Right, another COVID result here. So Jen, I know, was that the same thing with you in Vermont, COVID issue, or some other barriers that you see?
There were just other priorities in the committees that would have been working on it. So hopefully, I think it's definitely on their radar. And it was the chair of the Natural Resources Committee in the House that sponsored the bill. So there's definitely a will. They just have to make that time.
Right. Okay. Thank you. And Dawn, a little bit more complicated in New York, but what do you see as the major challenges to overcome?
Well, I think we did a cannonball into this pool here, and now we just need to jump a little quietly next time. We made a big splash. We got a lot of exposure, and now we need to get the assembly on board. And to Danny and Jen's point, there were just a lot of other priorities that were consuming the policymakers. So like I said, we've made that dash. And we need to educate a little bit more and kind of close the gap. And maybe next year that'll be our year.
Great, thank you very much. Well, great answers. And now with that, Lynn, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Great, thank you. And that was just everybody so wonderful. And let me just say that you've been getting a number of extremely well-deserved kudos in the comment box or question box. So you'll have the chance to hear in more detail later, but let me just be sure that you know how appreciative the audience has been. So there's questions for everybody. There's a lot of general questions, but Sydney and Scott, I'm going to start with two questions for you. One is specifically around PROs. So packaging and paper, EPR, is looking at a lot of different consumer products. They're made out of all kinds of different things. So when you do a PRO, is it one PRO or is it one for each type of packaging or one for each type of material? How do you envision that fitting together?
Sydney, go for it.
Okay, so great question. Of course, it's not really the same in any existing system, but typically, how should I phrase this? Let me say this. I would be surprised if we ended up in the US with a separate PRO for every type of material, like a PRO for aluminum stuff and a PRO for plastic stuff. That's possible. So nothing in the legislation that I've seen precludes that from happening. But what's more likely is you would end up with one, maybe two PROs, and they might be like packaging and non-packaging paper stuff, or they might be like if there's a really niche material that like has recycling potential but not in the blue bin, not in the curbside system, for example, like flexible packaging is an example that I always use because we've worked with that material, but that's a good example because like in theory maybe it could be recycled, but it really doesn't belong with everything else commingled. So have people get a PRO for that, doing like a separate program. But realistically, what we see in existing systems is mostly a single PRO. Again, there are options.
The world's your oyster, or your oyster is the world, whichever way it goes. So one last PRO question. You passed your law, it has a PRO. How do you ensure that the cost of residential recycling and solid waste services doesn't get worse than it is, and or possibly the price goes down? What would guarantee that?
Well, I was going to say, I mean, there's no guarantees about anything here, but there's annual reports that are put in from the PROs themselves that would go to the state oversight agency. So they're monitoring the bill, and it's just like any other EPR law, that there's the stewardship plan that is the blueprint. You know, it's how to implement the program and how all of the producers will be in compliance with the law. And then there's the annual report that they submit, and they'll say, you know, how things are working according to the performance goals, the convenience standards, the cost of goods. I know that's been a red herring, frankly, that has been coming up about some York University study that really is, it's quite disturbing because it's, you know, it's based on very flimsy evidence here, and we haven't seen any evidence of consumer goods increasing. But let's say that is the case. Well, those can be corrected like any other EPR law. You know, these laws are created with the best knowledge that we have at the moment. And we have to understand that we're going to need to be at the controls here, operating the state agencies, the local governments. That's why the advisory council is so important, so that everybody can look at the data and have their input into it. There's program plans that will be reviewed. Most of the laws have at least every 5 years or so, or when the state oversight agency wants it to be and thinks it's important to have it reviewed, and gives the tools, gives them the authority to require additional work by the producers themselves. So these are living systems, and they're not static. They grow over time. We learn more. We bring knowledge from Europe and Canada and other places. So I think that's the answer that I would give.
That's a very interesting way to a perspective, that it being a living system. That's helpful. Thank you. So several people in their presentations, one way or another, brought up the issue of infrastructure. And one questioner asked flat out, do any of these laws envision enough money that MRFs would be able to significantly increase their equipment? Robotics, flex packaging, you know, really a whole new generation of behavior. Is this anticipated in some way in any of these laws?
Yeah, I mean, I can just start overall by saying absolutely, emphatically yes. And that's really one of the, when you talk to producers about EPR, that's really one of the only things that convinces them, if anything can, that this is a good idea, because you know, they really want to see more and better infrastructure. And we all know the evidence is overwhelming that that's what we need in our recycling system. So we know that money is needed for that. And the idea is that the funds should be enough under any EPR system to not just cover what our current costs are, right? But they have to cover innovation, expansion of access, better infrastructure, all that good stuff. But I'll let each of the panelists answer that for their bills.
Yeah, I would say that it's definitely in our bill. I think it's not very specific, and you know, it's kind of open-ended that it just covers infrastructure, or money will be dedicated to infrastructure. And I think it's in the report, like a certain percentage. They just have to report out what that percentage is. So it's not very explicit or directive, but it's there.
And Dawn, were you going to contribute to that answer?
Yes,
thanks,
Lynn. I wanted to add that that we have a needs assessment built in to our law, and that goal is to identify where do we need enhancements, where are those infrastructure demands, and we know that you know, a lot of the motivation behind New York's packaging policy is to get us out of this plateau we're in with recycling. Our rates haven't changed for 20 years. And as the products have matured and evolved and are very sophisticated, we need to match that infrastructure. And we hope that the needs assessment and this policy does that.
Interesting. And Danny.
Yeah, I'll just add, very similar to Dawn, our bill through an amendment added a needs assessment and a related requirement to create a grant program. And while, like Jen, the number is not named, like what, you know, exactly how much needs to go into this grant program, ours is very specific in what the grants can support and who they can support. So just really quickly, that it just says, you know, grants can go to local governments, regional waste management entities, and private entities for the following, you know, uses, and that's programs and infrastructure for end of life markets for recycled products, recycling, sorting, and processing technology, advanced recycling technology, and then expanding composting, and then consumer education and reducing contamination as well.
Thank you. Yes, Scott.
Just quickly, one thing that helped me to think about this is the words maintain the existing infrastructure and expand for new infrastructure. And that's what these bills are intended to do.
Great, thank you. So several of the audience members asked a similar question, obviously slightly differently, but with the significantly increasing value these days of residential recycling commodities, do you anticipate that in any way weakening the arguments that you're making for the needs for these laws? So maybe Danny, do you want to go first with that?
You know, I feel like that's a more general question, and I'd rather just kick it to Scott or Sydney, to be honest. Because yeah.
That's fine. Take it away, Scott or Sydney.
So I could jump in on that one. First of all, markets fluctuate. You know, wow, we can, you know, breathe a little bit easier today because there's more value. And then we're like, oh my gosh, we've really been asleep at the wheel, which we have been, you know, over the past years. And then we're back in the panic mode. No, markets fluctuate. They're good, they're bad, but it always costs money to recycle. Let's not forget that. Recycling is not a revenue source for governments. You know, if you're recycling, it's a cost. At the best, it's lower cost than trash disposal. If you have a high trash disposal and your recycling costs are moderate or you have good contracts, but it's a cost to manage the material. That's why source reduction is best. That's why reuse is best. In addition to environmental issues, it saves money. So no, I'd say absolutely not. That this is a strong, full speed ahead. Don't slow down. That is just that would be awful if that was the message.
Yeah,
I mean,
to be clear, it would be awful.
That was my hunch, but I didn't have the confidence to say it so strongly. I mean, the data
Danny,
we
would
got
you like
from
to say that now? It would be awful.
just, you know, based on the data we got from counties, most were losing money on their recycling programs, and in the past, some of them had not been. Some of them were making money, and then obviously the China sword policy had an impact there. So I think Maryland's taking the approach of trying to bolster, you know, demand for recycled content, or, you know, to bolster the market for materials that use recycled content simultaneously, and then creating programs like this that will kind of connect the dots. So we definitely see the need financially for sure. And then of course the environmental goals are given.
Great, thank you. So Jen, somebody asked a question specifically for you about why bottle bill material is not part of your proposal. And another person asked about other examples of either where bottle bill material is specifically included or excluded. And Jen, I suspect you know all of that. So if you could help us out.
Yeah, so the bottle bill is exempt because it already has its own program. It's a very, very popular program. And when we actually introduced an EPR for packaging bill, the state of Vermont had an EPR for packaging bill back in 2011. And that eliminated the bottle bill in that bill and just brought it all into the EPR system. And that was met with an incredible amount of opposition. So it's not a necessary thing to do. It's working the way it's working. It gets a little bit more complicated. British Columbia does have a bottle bill as well. It's working well, and they've developed a system where, say, for example, the bottle bill containers end up at the MRF instead of the redemption centers, and the way that the redemption centers process them. There's a whole reimbursement system for the EPR program from the beverage manufacturers. So it can be a little bit more complicated with the implementation, but they can work really well side by side. And as I said, I just don't think we could possibly even pass a bill that eliminated the bottle bill. It's just way too popular.
And of course, yours just expanded, or is about to.
Well, they're looking at expanding. Yeah, there was a bill that it's halfway through and looking at expansion.
Yep.
Right.
Yep. Great. So Dawn, somebody was particularly curious about your comment that the print media folks, newspaper and magazines, pushed back. What was the nature of their opposition?
The nature of their opposition was that they are a product, they're an industry and a product. Newsprint cannot change what it prints on. It already uses a high amount of PCR material, and there's no other media to use. So they felt that they were targeted, and that it would increase their expenses substantially and largely cause them to, and I'll paraphrase their thoughts, was that they would end up having to reduce staff, reduce stories, and that would reduce service of the free press out to rural communities. That was their argument.
Okay, thank you. So could Dawn and Danny, could you please compare how the two models, those differing models, New York and Maryland, would work in terms of the requirements for PRO? Just, on a high level, what's different about the PRO system proposed in your laws? Danny, do you want to go first, or Dawn? Obviously, either one of you can go first. One of you, not both of you, will go first.
Well, I'll just summarize where we're at with our PRO. So we put a lot of emphasis on the PRO to create a plan, and that plan is then approved, reviewed, and looked at by an advisory committee, and then sent to our Department of Conservation for final approval. There's a lot of requirements on the PRO, almost, I don't want to say self-governing, but we ask them to create their goals, and we give our governance and our guidance there. So they have the opportunity to work within the confines of their clients, being the manufacturers, and present that to the state. I think that's the simplest way of putting it.
Okay, and we're just about out of time, but Danny, would love to hear a quick perspective about the PROs in Maryland's proposal.
Sure, ours is frankly very similar. We set the framework and lay out the guidelines for goals and fee structure, but they come up with all the details, of course, subject to approval and pushback from MDE or whatever adjustments need to be made from the department's perspective. I guess the biggest difference is that we only allow this municipal reimbursement model and the plan that drives that, whereas in New York, I guess there'll be an option for full EPR to go beyond just reimbursing, to actually operate the collection, sorting, and transport there.
Tremendous. And I'm sorry to both have to leave unaddressed literally the remaining 45 questions. But to thank the audience and especially our wonderful presenters, really tremendous job. And it's been great collaborating with PSI and NMOA on this, as well as all of our wonderful presenters. And Terry, do you want to say a final word or two?
No, I just want to echo your thanks to everyone, all the panelists, and working with PSI. This has been really a pleasure, and maybe we can do this again sometime. Thanks everyone for joining us. Thanks for your questions. We will share the questions with the panelists. I will say we will post the recording of this webinar and the slides on our various organizational websites and let you know about that. So again, thank you everyone, and have a good rest of the day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Terry.